I'm here to do a tutorial on thumb gussets. This will work for fingerless mitts like I have here, also mittens, gloves. I think that's everything that requires thumbs. And I am making this because someone requested it after my heel gusset tutorial. Welcome to my kitchen table. I noticed that most of the tutorials on YouTube, the knitters are knitting over a table, and I think that helps with focusing, so that's what I'm going to do. As you can see, I have finished the thumb on the first mitt, and so that you guys can see the goal. There we go. So it's just reverse stockinette and then ribbing to make it fit well. And for me at least, the problem zone with thumb gussets is always right there. So I'm trying to get you guys a good view that there aren't any holes to make the base of your thumb cold. So right now, this is what the mitt looks like before we've added our thumb. This is a pretty traditional style in that while you're knitting the mitt, you start increasing for the thumb gusset, and when you have about a third of the amount of stitches that you have for the body, you put those stitches on waste yarn. And some patterns call for you to cast on stitches in that row, and some of them don't. So that will affect how you decide to pick up stitches in the gusset. I made up this pattern myself. I adapted it from a sock pattern, and so I did not cast on any stitches, but it really just depends on the pattern. If you're making up your own mitts, as I said, aiming for about a third of the body stitches for your thumb gusset is a good way to go. So first, obviously, we need to get these stitches onto the needles, and I use dpns because I just prefer them for small diameter knitting. I have 15 stitches, so I'm going to put 5 on each of 3 dpns. Usually I use 4 dpns to hold the stitches and 1 more to knit around, but when it's this few stitches, then that would just be overkill. It would be very unwieldy. 3, 4. DPN, of course, stands for double pointed needle. Presumably, if you watch my podcast, you have figured that out by now. Okay. One more. The first time I made mitts, they were the second project I made, and when it told me to put the stitches on waste yarn, I thought that meant that I had to knit the stitches onto waste yarn. So nowadays I know that I can just thread the waste yarn through. Okay, so this is what it looks like once you've got your stitches on the needle. There's this kind of gap up at the top, right? And when you're knitting the body of the mitt, on that row where you put the stitches on waste yarn, it's important to make sure that these stitches are as snug as you can make them, because that's going to help with trying to avoid holes. The other thing is, honestly, I usually end up with some little holes once I'm done knitting. So what I do is I leave an extra long end, and then I just, when I'm weaving in the ends, I sew up those holes. And I'm going to show you guys how I sew them up. But first, it's up to you whether you want to pick up the stitches first or knit around first. I like to knit around first just because it feels like it gets the whole thumb a little more established. Since this is a pretty fiddly process, it's definitely not my favorite thing about knitting, doing thumbs. For some reason I don't mind fingers as much with gloves. Maybe because that just seems more like magic. Okay, so we're just going to knit, or in this case purl around, because I did it in reverse stockinette. And try to make sure that our needles behave. I happen to have knit these mitts throwing or doing English style. Wow, it's really hard to knit above a table. Okay. But obviously all of this applies to continental or pickers or left-handed as well. on there. Oh, I reversed it. Okay, so now we're at our gap. Now, this is where it matters if the pattern had you cast on a stitch, or 2, or 3. If it did have you cast on stitches, you're going to want to pick up into the base of each of those new stitches. However, my pattern didn't have me do that. So what I want to do is avoid picking up a stitch here, because look, if I pick up a stitch right here, that's where that yarn has been quite stressed, and we end up with a gigantic hole. I don't know if you can see that. Yes, okay. So that's what you don't want to happen. Instead, and I usually pick up 2 stitches if I haven't cast on any new ones when I was knitting the body of the mitt. I'll pick up 2 stitches for the thumb gusset, and then if it matters how many stitches I have, I just decrease those 2 stitches to 1 stitch. In this case, since I'll soon be doing 2x2 rib, I need to have 16 stitches total, not 17. So, and then if I cast on 2 stitches here, then I would pick up 4. So I always make sure that I'm picking up 2 into the side. So as I've shown, this is not a good place to be picking up stitches, and neither is this. And you can see what happens, that you're just asking for trouble there, because that yarn has been stressed by trying to bridge this gap when you were knitting the mitt, and we just don't want it to be stressed anymore. So instead, I look over to the side and see how these are much firmer. Like when you put your needle in there, even if you only catch 1 piece of yarn, you barely see a hole. But I don't like to catch just 1. I like to go right into the side, the same way that I do with the gusset. Hang on, let's see if we can get a little closer. Yeah, okay. Closer still, perhaps? So this is the side of my mitt. This is the top. And that's where you don't want to pick up stitches. So in this case, you can kind of see that there's the V, so that's a stitch, and then there's a purl next to it. So what I do is go into both sides of that purl. And then just to see, oh, look, that made a hole. Hang on. You can test it before you're committed. So do you see how you can kind of see my finger poking out? So that was not the best place to do it. For me, honestly, doing thumb gussets is a lot more of an art than heel gussets, where I just follow the same technique every time. So I know that that wasn't the best option. So what if I pick up into the purl bump? Let's see what happens there. Okay, now I don't have a hole. I think you can tell. There's no stress on that fabric. So that's my first picked up stitch. My second picked up stitch, I'm picking all the way over at the side. I'm just pretending that these don't exist. I know that it looks like a big amount for you to be bridging, but since you didn't cast on any stitches here, this is supposed to be small, right? It's not supposed to be this super wide section. If you had cast on stitches here, then you would pick up just like you do for a heel gusset. Okay, so now I am looking over here. I'm going to go back on the table, and I'll just try to crop later. Well, no. I want you guys to be able to see. Ooh, okay. There we go. So, once again, I don't want to pick up into this stitch because that would mess up my leaf. But there's these little purl stitches over on the side. And obviously that's a bad idea because look at how big that one gets. And what about that? Would also be a bad idea because it makes a little hole. Basically, you're looking for something to go into with your needle that when you pull it a little does not lead to a massive hole. So once again, I'm going to go into the purl bump because that's what works best for this pattern. It's really going to depend on the pattern though, and the best suggestion that I can give you is to just keep experimenting. Don't worry about these holes, that's lace. Okay, so then the same way that when I do a heel gusset, I try to make sure that those stitches aren't unduly stressed. I do the same thing here. So I just knit the first 2 stitches from that first needle onto my last needle just to help close up that gap. And then stop and evaluate, because it's much easier to rip at this stage than it is when you have thumbs. So as you can see, I did end up with a hole right here. It's not super noticeable until you put your finger there. And that is why I have this nice long tail, and I'm just going to close that up afterwards. Let me show you. So when I picked up the stitches for this mitt in exactly the same way, and I just wove that end in. Come on, camera. I just wove the end in to disguise the hole, and you really don't have a hole here. That's the same spot as right there. The other thing you can try to do is pick up some extra stitches there and decrease them. But honestly, with this mitt, I should have cast on more stitches, and because I didn't, that fabric is quite stressed. So I just don't think that picking up extra stitches and decreasing them would lead to any fewer holes. So I'm going to go ahead and knit this thumb around. Once you've picked up the stitches, you just knit the way that you would normally, or whatever the pattern tells you to do. And I'm going to go ahead and finish knitting this thumb, and then I'll be back to show you how I weave in the end to get rid of this hole. Hello again. So I finished up the thumb. It's the same amount of stitches. I know it looks bigger. Anyway, and I went ahead and wove in the end from the top of the thumb just so that you guys could see more clearly what's going on with this end. So now it is time, and I just have a tapestry needle. I like the pointier ones for work like this, but a blunt one will do the job too. You'll just have to fiddle it a bit more. So we just thread it, and then you're going to want to put your hand inside the mitt so that you can see what that hole is doing. I'm trying to make sure that the thumb isn't going to cast a shadow. So as you can see, where we picked up stitches, there's not really any holes. This hole is from where, obviously, when I was knitting the mitt, I should have cast on another stitch or two when I put the thumb stitches on waste yarn, but I didn't, so we'll fix that now. Okay, so basically the same principles that you follow when you're picking up stitches apply to when you're sewing to close a hole. You don't want to go through there, because then you've just got a new hole. Instead, go through, in my case, the purl bumps, but it'll really depend on your pattern. And what you want to do is basically weave the yarn in a circle around the hole. And then snug it up and see, and you can see it's getting smaller, and it's not putting a bunch of stress on the other fabric, but it is putting a bit of stress on it. So what I'm going to do now is, so that was the half circle on the body of the mitt. Now I'm going to weave it through the thumb part of the mitt to start to close that hole up. So as you can see, and look, that pretty much closed that hole. Remember, it was really big. Now, no matter how hard I push my finger, no hole. Now I don't want a hole up here either, and once again, this is because I stressed that fabric too much and didn't pull my stitches tight enough, but that's okay. So what we're going to do to make sure that that isn't stressed is, instead of going right here, you always want to weave around when you're trying to close a hole. So I'm going to go to the side of that, then through the purl bump that is above those two long stitches, then back down the side, and then I think I'll go across right there at the base of the thumb and tighten that up, and now the fabric is as solid as you could want. And then when you wear it, let's see, that's a tricky part to tell my camera to focus on. Okay, so when you wear it, that's a lace hole, that's not a gusset hole. As you can see, there's yarn overs there too. There is no hole anymore. So that's the way that I do thumb gussets. Instead of trying to close all of the holes when I'm picking up stitches, which I always feel it can get very frustrating very quickly for some reason with thumb gussets in a way that it doesn't with heel gussets. I just use the ends that I'm weaving in to close up the hole afterwards. And as I showed you, instead of sewing right into the hole, you sew a circle around the hole, and then you just pull it like a drawstring. And that is how I close up holes when my knitting is being uncooperative. I really use this method the most on gussets. I would say most of the handwear that I've knit, I've probably had to weave in little holes or close holes by weaving during the finishing process, but I mean that was in real time and it took what, 2 minutes? And then as long as you weave that end in snugly, that will last for a long time. I don't have any holes in any of the thumb gussets, and I wear my mittens especially a lot during the winter. I hope that helped you. Once again, if the pattern that you're doing does have you cast on new stitches when you're doing the thumb gusset, then you would just pick up 1 stitch for each of the newly cast on stitches. And here are my finished mitts. If you are curious about how I adapted the pattern and all that kind of stuff, the project page for these is called The Falling Leaves Mitts, and it's on my Ravelry notebook, which is the charm of it. And as always, if the method seemed wrong to you, then just don't do it. There are a bajillion ways to knit well. So, I hope that this helped. Bye!